Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. Welcome to Roundtable, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm your host, He Yang, joined by Huang Shen and Lai Ming. Good as always to have you, our dear listeners, with us. We have some fascinating topics for discussion today and every day. On today's program, how has the living environment changed for rural villages in recent years? And our special segment, Motivational Monday, that's when we give you that adrenaline shot to get you feeling right for the beginning of the week. You can find us on Apple Podcast at Roundtable China. Subscribe, rate, and review us. It will help other folks to find the show. But first, on today's Roundtable. According to the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, China has made great strides in a nationwide rural cleanup program. With around 80% of Chinese villages joining in, more than 30 million tons of household waste and 13 million tons of sludge in rural areas have been cleaned up. So let's take a look at this movement of improving rural living environment.
Well, some official information, the country unveiled a guideline late in 2018 to call for a campaign to clean up the rural living environment, which has been carried out in various forms. The document requires villages in eastern China and the developed rural areas in the central and western parts of the country fully implement the action plan. In the less developed rural regions in western China, garbage sorting should be implemented in about 90% of villages, and 85% of rural toilets should meet hygiene standards. Random domestic sewage discharge should be well managed, and rural roads should be remarkably improved. The central authorities and local governments are to increase the physical input in the rural areas, and private companies are encouraged to participate through public partnership and franchise businesses.
This is really interesting in the sense that there's all this talk about, this is what, I mean, you have just mentioned, this action plan has been part of the national efforts to guarantee basic living conditions for those living in rural areas. And would you walk me through that and its relationship to the subject?
Well, sure. The guidance regulates the completing dangerous house renovation tasks, establishing and improving the basic rural housing security long-term mechanism should be done before 2020. Improvement of the rural drinking water safety and completion of rural drinking water safety project tasks all over the nation should be completed by the end of 12th five-year plan. The improvements are done to strengthen the rural road construction and help the villages solve the difficult problems of muddy roads. A new reliable, advanced, energy-saving and well-managed rural grid will be completed, which is aimed at promoting renewable energy power supply and resolve comprehensive problems related to electrification, rural resident house, and strengthening the construction of infrastructure to prevent geological disasters or floods. And also, we're talking about basic living conditions that governments is trying to improve here. And it's important to realize that the term basic can have different connotations depending on what age you're living in. I remember when I was a kid, basic means, different things, whether you're living in rural areas or whether you're living in, let's say, in an relatively urban area. My grandpa was living in a relatively downtown area, but even for them, basic living meaning living in an apartment that was built by the company and then paid for by individuals, of course. But that housing is very rudimentary in the sense that there wasn't a lot of tiles. There weren't tiles on the floor, and therefore there was only concrete floor. My grandma was very diligent. She cleaned the floor every day, mopped the floor every day, so that everybody can walk on the floor barefooted. And that's the situation in downtown county. My parents' home, we were living in a village. We also had concrete floors, but my parents, they made a point of painting the bedroom floors, so it's somewhat smooth. I can afford to walk around barefooted and also sometimes lying on the floor, so it's very comfortable at that moment. And then compared to their living standards, I think my mother's parents, also my grandparents did on the other side. They were living in rural, currently suburban, but they were living in rural areas. And they didn't have concrete floors. They were living next to, let's say, rice fields and vegetable fields, and therefore the floor was constantly muddy, and they were sort of depending on this very rudimentary latrine toilets. I remember having to duck every time I entered for fear of running into spider webs, and I was terribly scared of spiders. So living conditions at the moment, was basic, like we said, very, very basic, but compared to what we are experiencing now. And nowadays, apparently in first-tier cities, second-tier cities, in urban areas, we're living in high-rise buildings with tiled floors and tap water and then electricity. So all kinds of facilities that comes with the modern way of living. But maybe in rural areas, depending on where you look, here the guidelines is distinguishing villages in eastern China and developed rural areas in central and western parts of the country from, let's say, less developed rural regions in western China. So there's a distinction too, and that may be a huge difference. I remember going to a visit in eastern China for a wedding that was hosted there, and clearly that wedding was held in let's say a rural housing. You can see from the space of it, it's so special, so big, and a lot of waste of spaces. But you can see that it's agricultural land and a residential building being built there. So it's very special, and you can see even there, the quality of living is a lot higher than, let's say, sometimes in my hometown, in urban areas. The floor is always clean. There are tiled floors, and you have tap water, and you can see the material of the construction of the buildings is very high quality. So there's a difference here.
Yeah, and that's a stark difference, regional from regional areas, if you make a comparison. And also, it's interesting that, Liming, you also brought in the, I suppose, yesterday versus today. And let me just give us a little bit of clarification. When you talk about your grandparents, living in that house with the concrete floors that were, that's improved today, what kind of period in history will we be talking about?
They're still living in that apartment. I mean, but the apartment was built in the 1990s.
Right. Well, I'll give you a hand in, traveling back in time a little bit further, actually, as I visited my extended family's place in a small village within, that would be Liaoning province. And and back in the 1980s, my extended family lived in a 2-room bungalow, and there were no concrete floors. That would be considered as
a luxury?
Yeah, that would be something that only the family households with cash could afford. And back then, my uncle and his family had to live in that 2-room bungalow, which had dirt floor.
Yeah.
And I remember when he visited us, and he's really sweet and we all love him dearly, but there are differences in living habits, in the sense I remember, and I would like to say this lovingly. So basically there was a spitting happening within indoors. And at the time, even till today, I feel rather shameful for my reaction. At the time, I felt a little disgusted because if you, in urban settings, people don't spit indoors, right? So I was very young and I guess naive, and really today when I'm uttering the story to you, I feel very shameful of myself. I sort of let it out on my face that I was deeply uncomfortable by it. But and my parents were reprimanded me, and then was like, oh, that's okay, just and anyhow. So basically there was this difference in people's living habits, because back at home for my uncle, who's a great guy and a down to earth, just great man, well, that's what you do, right? Because if you have dirt floor, then it doesn't make a difference whatever you throw on it or whatever. And but as a young child, I didn't see that. And that was in the 1980s. So now, this year, I visited that family home again.
Ooh.
And Lai Ming, there's something that these homes share now in rural areas, that is there are tiles and well-made floors. And I realize people's living habits has changed as well, in the sense that I don't see my uncle spitting on the floor anymore, as you would go outdoors to do that stuff.
Okay.
But the outdoors, there's like a little yard area, and then the roads. What really impressed me was the roads. They were, they were concrete roads, not the muddy type, which can be a real hassle if you want to come in and out of the village during especially the rainy season. So these are some changes that actually I have seen firsthand. And Huangshan, I'd like to ask you about the regulations that go about this, about the changes in the rural environment.
Yeah, because after you improve the basic living conditions, then you need to upgrade to the next level, which will be maybe the environmental side, and also maybe from the how to make it more livable, and in terms of the rural construction. And for the environmental side and the rural areas, they should focus on the governance of living garbage and sewage. So an appeal is being made to help the villagers. They can start sorting their trash into separate bins and recycle the kitchen and some hazardous and other forms of waste, and vigorously carry out ecological cleaning, small watershed construction, and the whole country and the whole village should promote the rural river comprehensive treatment and separate the area between animal feeding area and residential living areas. So guide farmers to straw return or use the straw breeding method, promote rural cleaning project construction and the use of household biogas. They should also change the rural toilet, which is a highlight, and complete non-hazardous sanitary toilet reform tasks, and to prevent grain drying phenomenon on country roads, and to unify construction of dry field and productive public facilities. Honestly, I don't have much experience visiting the rural areas, but I heard some stories from my mom, because my grandpa on my mom's side, he came from a village in Shanxi province, and it's a very typical Chinese rural site. And my mom told me when she was a little girl, when she visited that village, the thing she was afraid of the most was a toilet.
Yeah.
It's very different
It's
from
always the toilet,
cities, and for her, it's a very unfamiliar experience. And whenever she walked into the toilet, she felt a little bit disgusting. When she was in her maybe 10 years old, and that was maybe the 1970s and in China. So in that time, honestly, the urban area was not as developed as now, but it was a shock for her when she went back to her hometown. But my mom recently, she revisited the hometown and from the village in Shanxi, and she said that everything seems like much better now, and you can see people are taking better care of their field, and the environmental protection is going on very well in the site. And but one thing shocked her this time was it seems like all the people who remain in the village are older folks, and you could barely see any younger generation stay in that village. I think maybe that's the reason why we need to carry out this rural living environment improvement campaign, because you want to encourage more young people that can feel comfortable of living in their hometown, and we can gradually bridge the gap of the urban lifestyle and the rural lifestyle, because each has its advantage and disadvantage.
That's because there used to be a gap here. I remember going back in college, I won my first scholarship and I was so happy. I wanted to get a PC, a computer, to play video games. My mom threw in a few hundred yuan so I could went ahead and buy a PC. But to my greatest dismay, I wasn't able to play the video game at home because, well, at the moment we were still living in the suburban areas. The region was still categorized as rural, and therefore the electric grid wasn't up to standard. So every now and then when I turn on the PC, if I can turn it on, it was shut down automatically because the electricity or the power fluctuates, and therefore no longer able to sustain the PC. So I was so sort of discouraged by the fact that we were living in that part of the country that I wasn't even able to play video games like people of my age. And then over time, I mean, certainly it's nice to see how these things, how these different criteria, how different standards are sort of looked at in terms of improving the living conditions. Certainly, we no longer have that problem with the electric grid at that part of the country. But then nowadays we're talking about maybe how local residents deal with their garbage. Apparently, only now, I mean, in Beijing. Today, we're talking about some garbage sorting business starting in certain parts of the city. And it's nice to see some actions being taken in rural areas because really, garbage sorting in rural areas, it is also important because without that, a lot of households, they usually resort to very crude way of disposing their garbage. It could be they could dump them into their own ponds, or sometimes people living in rivers, they don't bother digging a sort of a pond or a sink in order to sort of distill their excrements. They dump them directly into the rivers. I remember swimming in the river and smelling something bad, and then I see something floating alongside me. And that's somebody's excrement. So
it's all natural, Liming.
It's all natural. It's all organic, and just breathing, and then also maybe.
How did you feel after breathing this really organic?
Well, my father and I we were swimming in the river. We thought it was unfortunate, so we packed it up and went home and then took a shower again.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a smelly story that I did not expect coming. And if you have just had lunch, I apologize. And just another heads up, because this kind of content might still come up in the next 8 minutes or so. But yeah, Liming, you make a really good point. And why? Also like to ask why and where does this funding come from when we talk about all these like major improvement schemes that are happening around the country?
Well, it depends on what progress you're looking at. I mean, in terms of broadband China, introducing internet access to, let's say, the rural areas, I'm thinking maybe China's telecom service providers, they're taking a toll in this. They're doing this infrastructure building out of their own pockets, maybe some government subsidizing, of course. But in terms of, let's say, garbage sorting and garbage trucks coming to the doorstep to collect the garbage, I imagine there's nothing profitable about this, and therefore we have to rely much more on government subsidizing than we can rely on, let's say, the good heart of a business owner.
That's true, and I think that hits the heart of a governance issue. That is, when we're talking about the improvement of people's living conditions, a lot of it is not profitable, especially short term. So it's kind of hard to get private capital into this area, and also some of the things that you're doing for the greater good, somebody's got to lead that, and you don't see startups to be that interested in this area.
But now I think like we can see more like private capital to tap into this market because there's a large potential to explore, because for many companies maybe in the city sides and the market is already like saturated. So maybe now the rural side, it's a blank space and it's for you to tap into your new business. And I think the best way is, of course, we need government subsidy and government support. And if we can encourage more private companies to join this progress, that would be much better. But the best way is the villagers themselves. They need to have grasp some new skills and trying to explore some new business opportunities in the rural side, and then they can rely on themselves. So taking this like broadband campaign, for example, so after you can have the internet connectivity in rural sites, you can develop the e-commerce. And then for those like tech companies, they may give their like funding and to these areas who can have, establish a very prosperous like maybe e-business channel in the rural side. And for those farmers, besides doing agricultural works, they can find a better way to sell their products out. And also with this channel, it can try to enrich local people's entertainment or just leisure life. Is not only about, I need to make money, but I can also live a very abundant, maybe spiritual life. So that's very important, I think.
And also, speaking of funding, let's don't forget there is a form of economy in rural areas as well. I mean, we'll talk about collective economy or village enterprises. It used to be very popular at the very beginning of the reform and opening up. It is still a powerful force to reckon with in coastal regions, in eastern China. The reason why maybe the rural areas in eastern China is able to have such good facility is precisely because they have good village enterprises that would hand out dividends to villages, and enterprises that could help with the building of infrastructure. And therefore, when I visited that part of the country and attended that wedding, I was impressed by the infrastructure there. There were lamps on the road, and the roads were well built, and therefore the strength of the local economy really matters a lot in terms of improving the living standards in rural areas. Apparently, at the moment, the coastal region is more developed, according to the campaign, and also according to what we observe. Apparently, the way to go forward is perhaps to create economic opportunities for collective economy, for village enterprises to thrive in central and western regions as well.
That's a really good point. And also, I think that's maybe part of the economy story of these rural villages. But also, I like to say a little bit more about the leadership, because back to what I was saying earlier about some of these really good initiatives, how can you roll them out? Because it comes with an expense, and also getting people on board. Often you're talking about changing people's old habits, especially with the garbage sorting. Take that as an example. I mean, then to get people, easing them into this kind of living arrangement, it takes persuasion. It takes also possibly going into the homes and talking with villagers. And one setting of the rural setting that I find to be quite endearing and also I think different from the urban way of doing things is that these can be close net communities, and then often it takes the 村委会 or the leader
committee.
Yes, for these leaders within this little group and community to go communicate these ideas and persuade people to get on board. And actually, sometimes with these programs, the rural areas actually can implement them better because you start with a smaller group of people, and if you can execute it effectively in the small range, then actually the effects will show up earlier, faster, and people will benefit from it. As you mentioned those coastal areas, but also in some of those traditionally economically prosperous areas, such as the Zhejiang province or
coastal.
Well, yeah, and Jiangsu province.
Coastal.
Would you call them but they're not necessarily right next to the...
And Hunan province has done a really good job. Have you watched the latest season of 向往的生活 reality show? They visit a small village in Hunan province. That village looks super nice.
Well, apparently you want governments or people to sort of want to improve their lives, and then certainly some measures have been taken in different parts of the country, depending on whether or not they have that initiative or whether or not they have that economic strength. And just speaking about leadership, I'm thinking the issue about leadership is don't underestimate the power of our people living in rural areas. I mean, I personally, in my hometown, we organized a sort of a donation. I mean, every household donated money in order to build a road before the government had time and had money to build the road there. So the system of organization and also management was already there, even without anybody taking the leadership. So, and then let's don't forget, here in China, the rural at the grassroots, we have the election of village committee leaderships. So I'm thinking we already have a basis to go with in terms of motivating everybody in developing the new kind of way of living.
Yes, and 2020 is the year when we will check if a lot of these benchmarks have been reached, and an exciting year to look forward to. We'll be back after this break with more roundtable discussion.
Informed opinion and heated debate. Find out what's got China talking and join us for your roundtable discussion.
You're listening to Roundtable with myself, He Yang, joined by Huang Shen and Lai Ming. Coming up, battery prices for electric vehicles are crashing. But is it good news? And our special segment, Motivational Monday, coming your way. That's when we give you that adrenaline shot for the start of the week. Our podcast listeners can find us at Roundtable China on Apple Podcast. And thank you so much for sending us to the top 10 coveted seats again on Apple Podcasts. And it's because of your clicks and your listening time. And, sometimes I know you just click it open. You only listen for 5 seconds, but that still helps. And, so, bringing us with great enthusiasm and gratitude as we get recognized as one of the most popular shows on Apple Podcast overall. So thank you very much for that. And there's one app you can check us out too. That would be our 轻松调频 app. And now on Roundtable, as we continue our discussion. According to a new report from research company Bloomberg NEF, prices for battery packs that's used for electric vehicles and energy storage systems are down 87% over the last decade, and it is still falling. The battery packs will soon reach a price competitive with traditional internal combustion engine cars, is what these researchers are predicting. So, well, before we go into, judging it's good or bad, what are the detailed findings and what's driven the prices for battery down?
Well, according to the latest forecast from Bloomberg NEF, battery prices, which were about $1,100 per kilowatt hour in 2010, have fallen 87% in real terms to $156 per kilowatt hours in 2019. And by 2023, average prices will be close to $100 per kilowatt hours. Battery storage is measured in kilowatt hours. A large battery for an electric vehicle is about 100 kilowatt hours. In 2010, the average cost for that would have been $110,000. Now it's just $15,000. And according to Costa Samara, who researches energy and climate change at Carnegie Mellon University, the decline in battery prices keeps astounding even all the experts. Nobody thought it would drop this fast. And it's dropped due to improvements in manufacturing, battery chemistry, and tighter supply chain control. And the biggest beneficiaries are electric vehicles apparently. So I guess maybe car manufacturers here in China, they'll be happy. For this entire year, they've been complaining about the shortage, actually the lacking demand for electric cars, and also the fact that the Chinese government is scaling down on subsidies to electric new energy car manufacturers. And subsidies are going to go completely off the map by 2020. So they are looking at a very challenging year this year and the next. So maybe for them, the crash in the battery prices is a good news, at least.
That's interesting what's unfolding right now, because also I find it to be quite promising in a way that even the experts who work in this field, they have never fathomed that the price for batteries, which is the most expensive part in most electric vehicles, can go down this quickly. And let's go into a bit more detail, if we can, Huangshen, about what's bringing the price down.
Well, I think there are lots of factors, and they can bring the price down because according to BNEF's 2019 battery price survey, which published on December 3rd at the BNEF summit in Shanghai, it predicts that the cumulative demand passes 2 TWh in 2024, and prices will fall below $100 per kWh. So this price has been seen as the point around which EVs and electric vehicles will start to reach price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles. So I think this should thanks to the advancement of technology. So I think this is a pretty bright news because it will also contribute to the environment, because I think for more commercial vehicles in our daily lives, like the delivery vans and or other kind of vehicles, we can use the electric vehicles to replace the traditional vehicles.
So that's almost feasible in a way, as at least those industry insiders are setting a precise year, date, so to speak, that 2024 would be the year that would be the tipping point. And it's definitely really interesting to see if what really happens, if this prediction can actually be panned out. But also I think this year, as the industry insiders are saying that globally, there has been an increase in order size and also growth in battery electric vehicle sales. So I think you got to look at the global picture in that sense, that in certain parts of the world, this is definitely not only a trend, but this has become something that consumers, motorists, they are taking in as a first choice. And when you look at these car companies, when they roll out new models, and also in the car shows, especially there's a car show that recently has been staged in LA, and the name has just slipped my mind, but it's the new General Motors Mustang, and that is their signature car, which is a huge truck, but that's been made electric. Wow. So that's only one of the examples of how the auto industry is changing. And even with these traditional models that we know creates a lot of pollution for the environment, just to put it simply as that. But now they're looking at green options in replacing that, but also still retains the kind of glam and also, I suppose, psychologically strength that people feel when they're driving a humongous car. And it's really interesting to see how these car models have changed as well, because initially with the electric vehicles, we see smaller models, and then you see this more in Japan and also in lots of parts in Western Europe, that people drive these tiny cars. It's also almost like a
shoe.
Well, let's say a tin box, upgrade it a little bit. And but even with greener choices, that's changing too. And just to accommodate to the consumer's taste in different parts of the country, which is also leads me to my next question, which is with all this price drop that apparently is happening with the battery price of electric cars and also energy storage systems, what other sectors can benefit from it?
Well, apparently, you can't just say that maybe car manufacturers are only benefiting from this. Some experts are guessing that maybe it is going to the price drop in batteries. It is going to make a huge difference for household energy use as well, because, well, apparently with batteries being more affordable, maybe households can afford to buy one and keep them at home, and therefore I think in many parts of the country here, at least in China, people have a habit of using solar energy to heat their shower water. And now with this battery being affordable, people can buy them and keep them at home, and also use the battery to store whatever solar power they have generated using whatever device they have, and therefore they will be able to cut their, let's say, electricity bills. Well, the precise math, you have to do it in order to, before you place that order for that battery, but that's open a possibility, and therefore we're looking at a future where maybe every household can get to generate a portion of the electricity they're consuming, and that to me sounds like a good news.
Yes, and I think maybe it's a much broader message behind this price decrease. It seems like when the technology is mature or like developed in a very fast speed, it will become cheaper because people are getting smarter, and so in return, it will benefit the general public's life because you can use the technology with a cheaper price.
Of course, yeah. And with cheaper price, there are more solution, more innovation with this. Even with the industry of electric cars, some people are thinking that now with prices getting more affordable, it is possible for certain businesses to sort of come up with innovative ideas in terms of maybe they could afford to standardize the design of batteries, and therefore maybe BYD wouldn't be using a different battery from, let's say, Tesla, and therefore maybe a more efficient way to use a battery and solar energy would be that maybe there are stations like petrol station or gas stations where electric car owners can go and have a new set of batteries installed on their electric vehicles, rather than having to wait for, let's say, 40 minutes or an hour in wintertime, in freezing cold, in summertime, being fed by mosquitoes all the while. You see a lot of electric car owners complain about that very often here in China, and that so far has kept a lot of potential buyers from going for electric vehicles. And imagine with this gas stations or battery stations being built everywhere in different parts of the country, more potential buyers will be encouraged to go for electric vehicles.
Well, you paint a really rosy picture, and I see that there are plenty of benefits that people can enjoy with a cheaper battery price. But is it all good news?
I'm not sure, because a lot of it depends on how batteries are recycled, because we know that batteries and solar energy are greener than, let's say, burning gasoline, apparently. But exactly how electricity is generated, if it's solar, of course, it's clean. But if it's generated from burning coal, like many years ago in China, just a few years ago in China, a lot of the electricity being produced in China were produced by burning coal. So in that sense, you have to do the bigger math than simply looking at whether the battery is more healthy, more green, because ultimately burning coal is also detrimental to the environment. And also whether or not batteries are sort of put to good use after they're recycled. Right now, the biggest issue about buying electric cars is that the batteries, they don't last very long. Maybe for a few winters, the capacity will be lowered to a point where you have to get a new pair. Many car owners here are already complaining that the process is too long, so difficult, and their cars depreciate so quickly right after they bought it, that kind of thing. So whether or not batteries are recycled properly, whether the recycled batteries are put to good use, also affects the bigger math, the bigger ecological math.
That's a really good point, and it's almost like the well, it significantly affects the user experience. And also, would this person want to buy a second electric vehicle, or would other people be interested in doing so? It's all the living examples of those who have already purchased one, and what they say would affect what the future potential buyers would think about this so-called greener option. And with with those who own electric vehicles, there's also another like tip kind of thing, especially during winter time, as this is where we're at right now, that one must bear in mind. One way to save a little bit of electricity.
Don't turn on the AC?
Well, I mean, if you're okay with that, with the freezing temperature within your car, I guess that's okay. But actually, it's not that bad, especially if you live in maybe away from the northern parts of China. But
That's half of China.
that's true. Well, still, I mean, you've got those areas that are, really suitable for your electric vehicles 4 seasons around the year. Is that so when you start your car, do it slowly and try not to accelerate too quickly, as there are some of us who like to hit the so-called gas pedal. I mean, I don't know what the term is for electric vehicles. Electric pedal, maybe. like don't just go for it.
It's called an accelerator. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Is that what? Well, I'm not a car expert, as you can tell by now, but I do know this trick. That is, you got to take it nice and slow, especially during winter time.
Sure.
Yeah, give it a little bit of time to warm up. Okay. I mean, yeah, one philosophy one can take in life, in daily living, I suppose. But certainly with the electric vehicles, this is something that we've been talking on this show. And one benefit of being on this show for more than just a couple of years is that you get to firsthand feel and witness how the discussion's tide has changed. At first, this was something that people took with excitement, and also people were kind of on the fence as well about the electric vehicles. As I remember just 4 or 5 years ago, this was a novelty, and then it's been through its ups and downs, I suppose, especially with the subsidies. It used to be very generous, and it certainly got some people on board. And now, considering that even in Beijing, with the limited
car plate, though.
Yes, the car plate policy, that is, you got to get the car plate first, as you're often waiting in a line. Then purchase your car, maybe, right? That would be the logical way of doing things. But even
That's the only way to buy a car.
and even with electric vehicles, there's a huge queue as well,
right,
as people are waiting to purchase. So
I'm scheduled to get a plate by 2028. So,
really? But they previously they said it will just be 9 years in the waiting line.
9 years, that means 2028 now.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
In 9 years, I'll be able to get a car plate and maybe get a car.
Or who knows, maybe something else will pop up, in the sense that even 5 years ago, who would have thought that it's not called shared car, but the car hailing business has shaken up not only the taxi industry around the world, but also it has changed people's views towards car ownership. As once, not that long time ago, let's just say 5 years ago, owning a car was a status symbol. Now, so much less than that, I suppose. There's still, it would still be nice to have a car if you can, but it's not something that, let's say, the future mother-in-law would write it down as the requirement for, the future husband of her daughter, kind of thing. So you see social change that's also happening, and definitely really interesting to see how these changes take place. And
but don't you think it might be a bad news for Tesla? Because I'm a huge fan of Elon Musk. Because if a Tesla car could be that expensive, he can explain that we have the cutting edge technology. The battery is so expensive. We have to make the car runs longer than other brands. So we need a really awesome battery system. And now, how can he prove a Tesla car is better than the other electric cars? And since the battery price has been lowered down for 90% and will Tesla car dropped the price as well. So I think maybe the next option for him is like maybe he needs to hurry up to create, the flying car or just a Mars that can send you to the Mars.
Wow, that is very, very bad news to Elon Musk, who wants to go to Mars. Apparently, you never know how these technologies can bring us that kind of thing. I'm thinking the other thing about battery prices is that maybe the thing is, for now, you may be thinking that maybe battery prices is lowering, maybe the car manufacturers are going to have a better life. But I'm thinking with any technology that gets a little mature, like the technology that comes with internal combustion technology, once it is mature, people sort of take it for granted. There are no more innovations, no more experiments, and I'm looking at a near future where we're happy where we are. We're happy with the cost of battery. We are happy with the capacity of batteries. And there's going to be a period of time when we don't see a lot of exciting innovations in the industry.
That's also a really good point, Liming. I'd just like to add on to that because there is a danger when you see the whole industry or the most part of it sort of engage in this race to the bottom approach. And we have seen this in other industries, such as solar panels in this country, because, Chinese people can be very smart with manufacturing and also producing things that at a cheaper price than some of the other places.
Right.
And then with the solar panel industry, we saw that prices jumped like jumping off a cliff jump. And then that sort of just edged out a lot of the companies that still want to engage more into research and development because they just couldn't stay afloat when your competitors are just selling at dirt cheap price.
Yeah, lower price means lower returns and therefore lower investment in experiment and research and development.
So do you feel that we're kind of at the crossroads here or in the incipient stage of crossroads for electric vehicles and all this energy that is based on the electric battery?
Well, I give it another 2 years before I can make that judgment. And like they said, in 2024, they will reach the point where we can totally replace batteries or internal combustion engines with batteries. So that's when we can see where we go in terms of batteries.
Yeah, and Liming, that smart guy, he just dodged it, right? But certainly, I was asking you to do some crystal balling, but I know it's a little unfair, and you make a good point, so I'll take that. Thank you. And coming up on Roundtable, Motivational Monday.
Motivational Mondays. Motivational Mondays.
Every Monday, I am super pumped right after that promo. Yeah, so this week, let's start with Huangshan. What's your Motivational Monday share with us?
Okay, the quote I want to share with you guys is, to be beautiful means to be yourself, and you don't need to be accepted by others, and you need to accept yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I have heard a statement that just be yourself so much. It sounds like an amazing thing to do, and I definitely wish many times that I could just do that. But what I've wondered, though, is what in the world does that mean? Because what if someone is mean to other people? Is it okay for them to just be themselves and go on being hurtful to everyone?
Probably not.
Right. How about people who are fearful of being around of others and live in a hermit-like life? Like he or she may just keep avoiding people in his or her daily life. So, okay, so maybe you just be the good of yourself. Just be yourself and be a better yourself. But at the same time, if you are a good person from begin with, you just keep doing yourself. But if you are a very evil person, just don't be yourself. You just sometimes you need to jump out of your box and just think about how can I improve myself. And also for these kind of people, they need opinions from the other side. It's not criticism, it's just constructive suggestions. Yeah. Right? But if you just lack of confidence but you are awesome already, maybe you need to forget people's prejudice on what is the definition of being beautiful. Maybe you just go from a deeper level, just get rid of the superficial explanation of beauty and just trying to explore the inside gem of you, and then you will be beautiful.
Yeah.
Right. So if
And it should be Rihanna playing in the background, just shaped right like a diamond kind of thing. And Liming, I know you have something to say, but just quick follow-up question, Huangshen. I think for those, your diamonds inside, you're just not... You're not shy to the point that other people can realize that, I suppose, or sometimes you haven't even gotten those vibes yourself. Like, how can you find that? How do you realize that? How do you know that I need to polish myself off a little dust and I'm ready for that bright moment?
I think you need a trigger, or you need some friends to help you find your shining point, or you can just standing like in front of the mirror and talk to yourself, give yourself a little bit hint, saying, "Oh, off you go, your time to shine." Then you can shine like a diamond.
Exactly the kind of energy I need on a Monday. Thank you very much, Huangshen. And Liming, what do you have for us this
Well, I have a
Motivational
story
Monday?
again this week.
Oh,
and
great.
It goes back to the Three Kingdom period in the 3rd century. And that was a moment when China was divided in a state of political turmoil and military strife. On top of conflicts between warlords, there were also plenty of bandits. And our story took place about 2 scholars, Hua Xin and Wang Lang. They were traveling by boat to safety when a common stranger begged for their protection and a place to live on the boat. Hua Xin thought about it and rejected him. But Wang Lang said, "There's still room in the boat. Why not let him tag along?" So the stranger was allowed to get on the boat. Later, some bandits showed up in their tail and were gaining on them. Wang Lang panicked and wanted to drive the stranger off the boat in order to lighten the load and speed up the boat. And Hua Xin said, "I was just worried about this when I refused to take him. But now that we've promised to protect him, we can't just leave him behind because we are in a moment of crisis." So he kept the stranger on the boat until they reached safety. And now, because of this story, people came to judge Hua Xin and Wang Lang quite differently. Hua Xin may have looked a bit unsympathetic initially, but that's him being cautious and thoughtful, and later he proved to be quite responsible. Wang Lang acted in a spirit of compassion at first, but his decision was made without deliberation. Ultimately, he was selfish and without principle. The story is inspiring to me because recently I have been stuck in a difficult situation with regard to how to treat and raise my son. On the one hand, he's still just an infant, scarcely 2 months old. So as parents, we are supposed to give him unconditional love and answer to his every need. Supposedly, that's going to make him feel safe. On the other hand, there are times he's simply being unreasonable. My mother,
He's a baby.
yeah, my mother-in-law's approach was like yours. Her approach was to hold him in the arms whenever he starts to whine. But my guts tell me I shouldn't indulge and encourage him. In other words, when it is obvious that the little rascal is just throwing a tantrum, I shouldn't.
He's only 2 months old. Tell yourself
That's
about
not
that.
that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse. I mean, I think I shouldn't make it worse by rewarding him when he's just throwing a tantrum. I believe that'll give him the wrong idea growing up. So my mother-in-law's approach, like that of Wang Lang early on, looked like the nicest gesture. But who's to say such acts wouldn't lead to terrible consequences later on? So in case of my family, my son would grow up being a spoiled brat. And I think this applies
Don't be
to
too harsh on him.
And I think this applies to many other decisions that we make every day. And the history is full of people, full of terrible things done by good people with a good intention. But ultimately, we should think twice, even when we believe we are doing a gesture of kindness that makes us feel good about our conscience.
And I sense a deep division in parenting between the 2 generations. And Liming, don't go too hard on yourself. You're easing into your role,
Well, I'm
too.
just going hard on my son. Okay.
And that brings us to the end of today's Roundtable. You can always find us on Apple Podcast at Roundtable China. That's it for today. See you next time.